Hello, everyone. I am so glad you could join me today. I am very excited about today's story. But before that, I will introduce myself first. I am Miss Jessa M. Dutosme from BEd 3B. Today, we are going to learn about the story of A Rose for Emily, which was written of one of the great writers in America. He is William Faulkner. For that, here I'm going to present the character, theme, and the point of view of the story of A Rose for Emily. First, we have the characters. So here are the characters of the story. Miss Emily Gerson, the object of fascination in the story. Eccentric, reckless, Emily is a mysterious figure who changes from a vibrant and hopeful young girl to a cloistered and secretive old woman. Was born during the Civil War. Raised by her very strict father, she ignored the cultural and social progress exhibited by the New South, preferring instead to uphold the customs and standards of the pre-Civil War South. She continued the Gerson tradition of believing her social standing was more significant than it really was. Mr. Gerson, Emily's father. Mr. Gerson is a controlling, looming presence even in death, and the community clearly sees his lasting influence over Emily. He deliberately thwarts Emily's attempts to find a husband in order to keep her under his control. Homer Baron, a foreman from the north. He was a big, brash man with a loud laugh, making him an unusual romantic partner for the cold and aloof Miss Emily Gerson. He took Miss Emily on weekly carriage rides after his arrival in Jefferson, but had no intention of marrying her or any other woman at one point. Miss Emily's cousins, strict upholders of Southern class traditions, arrived and tried to keep her away from her suitor. But Homer wasn't the marrying kind. The text suggests that he was a homosexual a little more than a year after his arrival in Jefferson. He went into Miss Emily's home and was never seen again. To be Emily's servant. To be his voice, supposedly rusty from lack of use, is the only lifeline that Emily has to the outside world. For years, he thoughtfully cares for her and tends to her needs. Judge Stevens, a mayor of Jefferson, 80 years old. Judge Stevens attempts to delicately handle the complaints about the smell emanating from the Gerson property. We also have Colonel Sartoris, a former mayor of Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris absolves Emily of any tax burden after the death of her father. His elaborate and benevolent gesture is not heeded by the succeeding generation of town leaders. Here are the themes of the story. First, we have tradition versus change. Through the mysterious figure of Emily Gerson, Faulkner conveys the struggle that comes from trying to maintain tradition in the face of widespread, which is radical change. When Jefferson is at a crossroads, embracing a modern, more commercial future while still perched on the edge of the past, from the faded glory of the Gerson home to the town cemetery where anonymous Civil War soldiers have been laid to rest. For me, Emily herself is a tradition because steadfastly staying the same over the years despite many changes in her community. In fact, she is also a living monument to the past. She represents the traditions that people wish to respect and honor. However, she is also a burden and entirely cut off from the outside world, nursing eccentricities that others cannot understand. We also have the power of death. Why? Because death hangs over a rose for Emily. From the narrator's mention of Emily's death at the beginning of the story through the description of Emily's death, handed life to the foundering of tradition in the face of modern changes. In the very case, death prevails over every attempt to master it. Emily, a fixture in the community, gives into death slowly. The narrator compares her to a drowned woman, a bloated and pale figure left too long in the water. In the same description, he refers to her small, spare skeleton. She is practically dead on her feet. Emily stands as an emblem of the Old South, a grand lady whose respectability and charm rapidly declined through the years, much like the outdated sensibilities the Gersons represent. The death of the old social order will prevail, despite many townspeople's attempts to stay true to the old ways. In addition, Emily attempts to exert power over death by denying the fact of death itself. Desire relationship to the dead bodies of the men she has loved. Her necrophilia is revealed first when her father dies. Unable to admit that he has died, Emily clings to the controlling paternal figure whose denial and control became the only, yet extreme, form of love she knew. She gives up his body only reluctantly. When Homer dies, Emily refuses to acknowledge it once again, although this time she herself was responsible for bringing about the death. In killing Homer, she was able to keep him near here. However, Homer's lifelessness rendered him permanently distant. Emily and Homer's drastic marriage reveals Emily's disturbing attempt to fuse life and death. However, death ultimately triumphs. Next, we have the point of view of the story of a rose for Emily. We have first person peripheral narrator. Why? It is because the fascinating narrator of A Rose for Emily is more rightly called first people than first person. Because the narrator speaks sometimes for the man of Jefferson, sometimes for the woman, and often for both. It also spans 3 generations of Jeffersonians. Diba na-include man to siya ang generation of Miss Emily's father, then generation of Miss Emily, and the newer generation made up of the children of Miss Emily's contemporaries. The narrator is pretty hard of the first 2 generations, and it's easy to see how their treatment of Miss Emily may have led to her downfall. This lends the narrative a somewhat confessional feel. While we're on the subject of we, diba, did you notice that no one townsperson is completely responsible for what happened to Emily? It's fair to say, though, that some are more responsible than others. The willingness of the town to admit responsibility is a hopeful sign, and one that allows us to envision a better future for new generations to come. In addition, ganun ni prefer ko sa first person kay tungod atong pagkamatay ni Miss Emily, which is the whole town went to her funeral. So that's all for my assigned topic. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.